Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Creating Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools podcast. I'm Amanda Morin.
And I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. And today we're talking about the mental health needs of neurodivergent learners, which is kind of an interesting conversation because it's hard to sort through all of these different pieces. But I think it's really important to recognize that a big part of the reason that creating neurodiversity-affirming environments is so important is because it reduces the risk for other mental health concerns. For example, I remember when I was a kid, before I was even diagnosed as ADHD, school was really hard, for all of the reasons. And I remember specifically in second grade, our school was kind of on two levels. And so the second grade classrooms were on the first floor. And then you would go up this big, long stairway. And then the top was like the offices and then like the third through fifth grade classrooms. And so I would ask to leave the classroom so I could go to the nurse. I would walk up these big, long stairs. And as I was going up those stairs, I would hold my breath.
Ooh. Because
I would feel like if I would hold my breath, when I got to the nurse's office, it would make my mouth hotter, and we would use those little thermometers, like the ones with actually like the mercury and everything in them.
Yeah.
If I made my mouth hotter, my temperature would rise and I would be able to go home because I was desperate to get out of class. I was so anxious. I was always telling my mom I was sick and I didn't want to go to school. There was just so much overwhelm about that environment and feeling like I was always getting in trouble. Or especially as I got older, like I didn't have my work done. So then I would want to avoid having to go to school and not having my work to turn in.
Yeah.
But it was like this interplay there because the ADHD pieces weren't supported.
Yeah.
I had all of this anxiety about this. A piece of self-disclosure here, even as an adult, I went over a decade not treating my ADHD and thinking, oh, well, I don't know if that's really an accurate diagnosis, but treating myself for anxiety and depression and all these other things. And once I actually started addressing and treating the ADHD, my anxiety went away. I still have anxious feelings or whatever, but it's not the same as that constant generalized feeling of stress and anxiety and overwhelm.
Right.
That's kind of, in a lot of ways, my purpose with a lot of this, coming from that clinical background and seeing my clients and recognizing when we provide these supports and accommodations, we protect the overall mental health. Yeah. We offer some insulation from that anxiety, from depression, from all of these other pieces that go into that. I just think that that's so important.
It is. And I'm thinking about the story you just told, and I'm both sad for young Emily and wondering how you didn't faint going up the stairs, holding your breath the entire time. I mean, that's an amazing feat. Congratulations. I'm glad that you don't do that anymore. Right?
I've evolved past holding my breath to raise my temperature.
That's excellent. Excellent. It's interesting when you talk about how supporting your ADHD, supporting our students based on their neurodivergent brains and how it reduces some of the other things. It reminds me, I was talking to a student that I work with pretty recently, and we were going through the student's 504 plan and looking at the accommodations and just talking it over, which was kind of a neat thing to do anyway. And it was interesting because as we were looking at the accommodations, the student is both autistic and does have some anxiety, generalized anxiety. Mm-hmm. The accommodations were listed out in ways that actually I'd never seen before. We're talking about what it was supposed to support, right? Was it for the generalized anxiety? Was it because of the autism? And I asked this student, I said, do you feel like they're separate for you? Do you feel like being autistic is separate from the anxiety? And what the student said to me was, actually, when I'm allowed to be my autistic self, I don't actually feel that anxious. And I think that's a perfect summation of kind of what you just said. It's a really astute thing to be able to say, when I can be myself, all of the other things tamp down, they disappear. They're not as prominent. And I hope for all of our students that we give them that opportunity to recognize that. And I know that you had a great conversation with somebody we both know who works as a psychologist, both outside and inside school systems, and has a lot of experience around working with neurodivergent kids, Dr. Andrew Kahn. And I'm looking forward to knowing his perspective on this and what the conversation you had was.
Yeah, this conversation was really great. I love Andy, and I'm excited to share it with everybody, and it'll be up in just a minute. When I started working with neurodivergent students as a counselor, I realized how often their struggles were misunderstood. I remember one student in particular, bright and curious and full of potential, who was constantly in trouble for not following directions. Teachers saw defiance. I saw a kiddo who was navigating an environment that didn't work for his brain. He needed support and not punishment, but the systems in place didn't offer that. That experience really stuck with me and fueled the work that Amanda and I are doing now. We know that educators want to help their students thrive, but too often they just haven't been given the tools to do it. That's why we created our online courses for teachers. These courses are designed to help educators better understand and support neurodivergent learners. They offer practical strategies that teachers can use right away in their classrooms to create neurodiversity-affirming environments, spaces where all students feel valued and capable. Whether you're an administrator looking for professional development for your staff or a teacher who's seeking new tools to support your students, our courses can help. They're flexible and can be completed independently or as part of a team during professional development time. Visit neurodiversity-affirming-schools.com or click the link in the show notes to learn more about our online courses and how you can bring them to your school. Dr. Andrew Kahn is a licensed psychologist and the Associate Director of Expertise and Strategic Design at understood.org. With over 2 decades of experience, he specializes in supporting his neurodivergent clients at home and school. He has also contributed to policy development on mental health and suicide prevention for school communities. Beyond his clinical work, Andy has served as a clinical director at a community mental health agency and taught as an adjunct professor at the University of Maine. Andy, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to start off with the same question we've asked all of our guests, which is, what does it mean to you to be neurodiversity affirming?
So for me, and this is a bit double-edged because I'm neurodivergent myself. So in terms of neurodiversity affirming, I often think about the idea of just being present for the whole person and being present in a way that allows the fact that, you know what, our assumptions are what often get us into trouble when we get to know people, when we're working with people, or even, in the educational world. So for me, it's about having a healthy curiosity and acceptance for how I and other people happen to be different from one another. When we think about affirming neurodiversity, it's a lot of that same mindset, is that the idea that if our brains are doing things differently, I'm going to be willing to ask, I'm going to look for signs in our interactions, and really just try to be aware of, are there things going on here that are working better or worse for you? And just really being open to that experience. So much of the challenge is that, when we talk about the neuronormative perspective, is that, we assume that if someone's in distress, we have to be thinking about there's something wrong with them. There's something not working for them, as opposed to, I can really acknowledge and take the perspective that this environment isn't working for people in general, and how to figure out ways to create points of access and acceptance that really just think more broadly and less pathologically.
Mm-hmm. So you and I are both clinicians, and so we focus a lot kind of on the mental health piece that fits in with this. And I one of the things I'll often say when I'm doing a presentation or I'm talking to people is, when I have a client who comes to me who is autistic or ADHD, they're not coming to me because they want to fix the autism or they want to fix the ADHD. Like, that's what I kind of think about. They're coming to me maybe because that's not fitting within the environment that they're in, kind of like you were just talking about.
Right.
But when I have a client who comes to me and they're dealing with anxiety or they're dealing with depression, maybe they are neurodivergent, maybe they're not. But the goal there is different in some ways. I think it helps to reconceptualize it. And so how do you sort through the ways that we support those things differently, whether it's neurodivergence versus mental health? Like, is that all the same thing? Is it different? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
I don't necessarily see it as the same thing, in the sense that being neurodivergent really just refers to the fact that your neurology is doing things that are somewhat different than neuronormative folks. Where the rubber meets the road on the mental health side is when there's an experience of discomfort or impairment that results from that. When your environment does not provide you the opportunity to be comfortable, to be engaged, to do the activities of daily living in that environment, there are times where being neurodivergent, breaks from that. And very often that's what we hear. In fact, when I started my training, so much of the focus of the training was helping people cope. And the idea of helping people cope is saying the world is the way it is. You need to do better with managing it. And if you manage it better, you'll be happier, healthier, and your mental health will be better. And there's some logic to that in terms of, systems are slow to change. But for the individual, it can be sort of othering. It can be sort of off-putting in that regard. And I think that, over time, what I've come to think about is what is the balance between what the environment can do differently for more people and what the structures and societal things, or structures and academic environments and work environments can do to help more people be successful, as opposed to thinking about it as a pure pathology mental health side. The reality is the person comes to you and they're saying something isn't working. I'm uncomfortable. I'm not happy. I'm experiencing some sort of distress. And in turn, then we have to figure out how to navigate that with them. And sometimes it's a balancing act between some environments are unlikely or unwilling to change, so coping may be your only option, or feel like leaving an environment may be an option. But I think that's the balancing act here, is thinking about being neurodivergent shouldn't have to be something that is pathological, but very often our environments lead to failures of our engagement, of our involvement and ability to thrive. And that's where I see a lot of these things come into play. And it is a big focus of my work.
Yeah. When we talk about creating neurodiversity affirming spaces within schools, I feel like there's some changes and shifts that we need to make in order to support the mental health aspect. Like, how do we help reduce the anxiety? How do we help improve, the mood and those types of things? And that might be through some accommodations. It might be some other pieces. How important do you think it is for schools to try to tease that out? Or is it more just about what the result is as far as what those accommodations might look like?
The hardest thing to do in managing neurodiversity within a school is to try to think about how to do things best to scale, because that's the reality. They're a volume business. And let's just think of it as it is. Education is a volume business that has a childcare overlay. And I think that for so many of what we think about in schools, for me, it's about thinking about how can we create efficiency of scale that allows the school to say, we want as many of our students to be successful as we can. Are there things that we can do globally that will help students? Thinking from the UDL perspective. Universal design is probably my favorite concept, which is there are very few things we will do to accommodate an environment for someone's neurology that isn't going to have unintended positive consequences in terms of if I make this environment more naturally soothing and free for a person who's neurodivergent, is that in any way going to harm someone who is neuronormative? And in that situation, the answer is, I've never seen it.
Right.
I've never seen it. In fact, what we see is the modeling of those coping behaviors and the management accommodation behaviors, so to speak, is that if we allow all kids to access them, we see a more comfortable, healthier, more fluid environment where learning is just more naturally occurring.
I don't want to get too far in the weeds with this, but I know that you and I could talk for a really long time just about the diagnostic process.
For sure.
But I do think that people maybe who are listening might be really kind of curious about it. So just from an assessment, psychological assessment side of things, what are some of the things that you consider when you're trying to tease out diagnostically what's going on when there might be some neurodivergent types of traits, but maybe there's also kind of these psychological/mental health pieces that are a little bit different?
So I sort of think of it in terms of thinking of humans in the assessment process like each human is a different state on a map. And for folks who tend to be neuronormative, the boundaries between individuals who are neuronormative and their environments, the people around them, tend to have smoother boundaries. They tend to be more fluid. The interactions tend to be more expected and more smooth. With folks who are neurodivergent, we see more of a spiky set of interactions, meaning when we're trying to interact with other folks, there may be greater periods of misunderstanding, difficulties in getting your social needs met or feeling heard or accepted within the settings that you're living and working and going to school. I think that in terms of those pieces, the interaction between the people is one of the first areas I look, because if there's a disconnect, and usually it's developmental at first, you have a 12-year-old kid who's interacting in a stressed out manner who looks 7 or 8 years old. And I start to say, okay, here's a disconnect, something that doesn't match what you would expect for that individual. The other area where I tend to look at that is seeing how the individual and the environment interact and looking at things like sensory challenges. Are environments more stressful for your child than they are for other kids in their environment? Does your kid respond more rapidly, more frequently, and demand more in terms of what they need for comfort? And I think in those areas, those are the first areas I usually look at when I'm thinking about, okay, like, do I have a neurodivergent youth here who may benefit from certain things that are going to be pretty straightforward? To me, again, I have a bias. This is how I live my life. I'm always sizing up my environment. Where are the safe spaces? Where are the sensory spaces? What have I got on my person that helps me navigate this? But I think about in terms of where kids in school tend to struggle most, it is in the interaction of individuals with one another, the environment and the sensations. And oftentimes, as they get older, you'll see it more in terms of concepts. The idea that the concept of, are they more concrete in their understanding of things, or do they have more abstract thinking abilities? And in those situations, you start to see the areas where ideas, interactions, and sensations no longer match what you'd hope to see developmentally for a kid of that age. And that's where I start to look at, okay, this is starting to, tickle the spidey sense a little bit. Okay, what am I seeing? And I'm always thinking of it from that perspective, primarily because that's how I've lived. And those are the kids who I've worked most with.
Yeah. I like what you're also talking about, even with your own experience, about that intentionality of finding those places. I feel like many neurodivergent people of all ages do this kind of automatically, but maybe not with intentionality. They may not really realize what it is they're looking for or why they're looking for it. And I think the more that we can help kids understand, what is it that you need? What are the things that will help you? How can you make sure that you're kind of prepared? All of those help to mitigate some of those overwhelming experiences that they might have.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think there's a developmental progression that we look for in terms of the neuronormative sort of trajectory. And at the same time, and I think it's something we do poorly in the therapeutic realm as well as in the academic realm, is having a focus on self-awareness and self-advocacy. And those are the pieces that are going to drive success more so than many other components as kids become more self-aware of what they need, what their environment doesn't provide, and how they can request or ask for it in a way that they can navigate within reason. I think that working with kids, that's a skill that I scaffold all the time with kids. The first demand is on the adult, which is, we know, this child needs this support. If we can create some nonverbal signal that you as the adult have to decode because we're teaching you this strategy, then we accommodate that child in that way. And that over time, as that child has more adults in their life, they may have to articulate more and more of that experience to try to access things well. But feeling like, hey, this brings me success. This is reinforcing. Initially, for me and many, when I think about young kids who are neurodivergent, it's not reinforcing. They don't get the empathic response. They're not accepted, and they're continuously told, you've got to fit the same mold as everybody else. Go sit down and figure it out. And that's what leads to so much of the mental health issue. The longer kids with differences go without getting the support they need, without learning to identify more about themselves and their experiences, the more likely they are to experience that in a way of distress, anxiety, feeling down, acting out, using what they have in their repertoire to cope and manage their environment. And that's not always going to be functional. And that's unfortunately when we mostly see those kids, Emily, when they come to us.
Right.
Because something they're doing is disrupting their environment, even though they've been having all kinds of discomfort for lengthy periods of time.
Yeah. Last question as we kind of reflect on this. Something that I am frequently thinking about for myself is how much my view of things has changed throughout my career. Is there anything about your own evolution from when you started your career to where you are now that has really shifted in how you see these things? I mean, I think just societally, we have made huge changes. Is there anything that stands out to you where you feel like you look back now and you're like, gosh, that's really different than what I thought when I first started?
For sure. I think so much of what happened when I started out in the field, and keeping in mind that when I started my educational process, even going to grad school, I didn't know I was neurodivergent. I knew things were hard and I knew I was frustrated a lot. But, a life of masking and overworking and over-preparing and never being late because I was terrified of being embarrassed about being late, really was impactful to me. And I felt for so many of the professors I worked with when I was in grad school, this was all about teaching skills to that individual. And there was so little system focus. And I think that when I first started working in schools, I was stunned by the pushback of the system on how we work with kids and the inefficiency and ineffectiveness of that. And my perspective was, I felt like I had to pile drive through that. And I felt like I got very offended. I got very bothered. And I wrote lots and lots of recommendations that no one was ever going to do for each individual kid who I wrote reports on. So over time, I think the thing that's changed the most for me is understanding that the systems actually are going through their own series of development. And it is glacial at times, and it is political at times. We won't go too deeply there. But I think that so much of what this is like entering a space and finding your allies. And I think that working within a group of allies in your space, identifying how to make the things that we do feel natural to folks who are reluctant participants in working with neurodivergent youth particularly, has been the biggest shift for me, is that I'm always playing the chess game. Where are my people? Where is the fit? How do we make this work? And I think before, I was always trying to help, forgive the indignity of this, but saying, always trying to figure out how to fix the kid. That's what we were trained in. How do you fix the kid to make them function better with what's around them? And now I'm like, wow, that was such a Neanderthal way of thinking, as opposed to, the beauty of the fit right now, the tapestry of difference, looking at neurodivergence as a balancing of strengths and things that don't fit certain environments, and then helping people find the environments. I've very much changed in the idea that I'm not a college first pressure guy anymore. I want to find out, where do you fit? What's going to bring you joy? What's going to put you in a situation for success, and utilizing your neurology for things that you were put here on this earth probably to do, and the systems have been poorly matched. So I've really had a big progression in terms of, I look more at systems than individuals when I'm looking to look at agents of change. And I'm looking to also help my clients decode their experiences in a way that I can help platform and then give them that platform for themselves to advocate for self. Those are the biggest changes for me. And they've taken a really long time.
Yeah.
I thought myself very empathic, but I made all kinds of errors of judgment and assumptions. And I'm just working to give myself grace as I get to a different phase in my career.
Absolutely. It's important for educators specifically to hear that, because, through this book that Amanda and I have written, we are asking people to make a lot of big changes, and that's scary. And you do have to really question your own experiences. So I appreciate you sharing that.
No, for sure. It's hard.
It is.
It's so hard. And there are few things harder than teaching. I've spent so many years in classrooms, and I have such tremendous respect for teachers and educators as a general rule. So, this is a time to sort of give yourself grace, take a different perspective, and see what little changes you can make, because that's where this all comes from, is little changes, and big concepts come later. It will come very naturally.
Dr. Andy Kahn, thank you for talking to me today.
Thanks, Emily. It's a pleasure.
Emily, I have had the pleasure of actually working with Andy for almost those 2 decades, right? So I've worked with him in schools. I've worked with him at understood.org. And I'm always so impressed by how much of an advocate he is for the students he works with. I mean, just incredible advocate. and really gets them. And I think that's super important as we have these conversations. And it really shows me, so I want to circle back to this because it really struck me, is that we talk about teachers a lot, we talk about educators, we talk about classrooms. But when we're talking about our neurodivergent learners and we're talking about their mental health needs too, the importance of having a whole team who can look at all of the aspects that can help those students thrive shouldn't be underestimated. I think about that a lot when you and I talk, because I know that you come at this from a clinical perspective as well as a teaching perspective. I don't have that same clinical component of things. And I'm always realizing there's so much more to think about. That's something that I want to stress, is that having all of these perspectives really helps us advocate for the student and make sure we understand all of the pieces that's going to support them and help reduce some of those mental health concerns and struggles.
I think that's the piece that I really want people to hang on to with this, is the fact that just because somebody who is autistic or ADHD or dyslexic, like when you are in an environment that isn't supporting you, you're going to feel more anxious. You're going to feel more stressed as you try to navigate that world that wasn't created for you and that you're trying to adapt to, and you're trying to hide those different pieces of yourself. And when we provide opportunities for accommodations and understanding, we just want to really remember that we are then also supporting that mental health. We're preventing anxiety. We're preventing burnout. We're preventing the exacerbation of all of these different mental health concerns that don't have to be present, but are greatly impactful on somebody's overall well-being. I would say that anxiety and depression and all of those things are much more impactful to a person's overall quality of life than just the fact that their brain is autistic or ADHD or fill in the blank. Like, that is not in and of itself the major issue. And I don't want to minimize it. I mean, I don't want to pretend like those are not disabilities. And I mean, they do impact people's lives.
Yeah.
But again, when you boil it down, when we support these things, we can minimize that and improve their overall well-being and success.
I think you said it really well when you used the word understanding, right? Because I think we can understand our neurodivergent learners. We can understand how their neurodivergence impacts their experience in the classroom. But I think there's something bigger to understand when we're thinking about how does that impact their entire experience of the world? How does that impact how they are able to cope, right? And really, when we're talking about some of these mental health needs, we're talking about coping, right? And that's tough. And I don't want to minimize mental health needs. I mean, I know what it's like to have anxiety. I know what it's like to have obsessive compulsive thinking patterns, right? There's nothing just about that. There's nothing just to cope with. But I think understanding that can be mitigated makes such a difference. And I just want to make sure that teachers are able to think about the fact that you can understand two things at the same time, right? You can understand that your students are always going to be neurodivergent, and that is always going to be part of their experience. But their mental health needs are not always going to be part of their experience. Holding those two thoughts together is something that I would really encourage everybody to think about doing.
So we appreciate everybody for being along with us on this journey for this podcast. This is, for now, our last episode, and we may add things in the future, so keep us in your podcast feed. But we are so grateful for all of the work that you're doing, supporting your neurodivergent learners. And, let us know if there's ever any way that we can connect and support you on this path.
Thanks so much, everybody.